también por la Universidad Antonio de Nebrija y máster en Relaciones Internacionales. Con todos ellos vamos a hablar hoy. Y me gustaría dirigir la primera pregunta a Ron, a quien le agradezco que esté aquí. Además, siento un gran placer de hablar con una persona con su experiencia. Y la primera pregunta, Ron, es que espero que traduzcan bien, es: ¿crees que ha comenzado un proceso de desglobalización?
I must congratulate you. The translators have firstly the challenge of translating from Australian to English, and then from English to Spanish. So, good luck. But this is a serious question. I don't accept a bad reputation for free trade or for globalisation. I think the bad reputation has been earned by the special interests who have perverted the process of free trade and globalisation in a sense. And I think it's best, I'm not sure, very few universities in Australia teach in economics the public choice theory, but I hope that your universities teach the public choice theory because it explains how concentrated benefits go to certain people who work very hard to bring in and maintain legislation which is sometimes very bad policy, but they spread the costs of these bad policies over millions of people like us, and we bear these costs, but we don't march in the street because we're too busy doing our own business. So they are the people, these vested interests, who seek special privileges. They are the people that work so hard to bring in these policies that we sometimes say, how did that ever get into Parliament? How did that get past Parliament? It's the same explanation of how some of the worst people get to the top, because they work harder to get there because they have an interest in getting there. The really good people have got enough self-esteem. They don't have to work hard. They wait to be invited. So that's my answer to your question.
Muchas gracias, Ron. John, ¿crees que se ha iniciado un proceso de desglobalización?
First of all, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por recibirme tan amablemente. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí. I think the evidence certainly supports that with all of the players that you just mentioned. Trump, Marine Le Pen, Russia, and so forth. But I'm an optimist. And yes, I do think we're going through a deglobalization phase, as you called it. But I'm also confident that long-term, the benefits of free trade will be rediscovered. And it may be through new techniques that aren't available to us yet that new technologies will make available. Men and women will find new ways to self-organize. You know, they may have to go underground in order to do it. Imagine a version of Uber or Airbnb that were so completely distributed and peer-to-peer that people could connect with each other and for whatever it is they wanted to do, transportation, lodging, any services or products at all, and find each other and engage in free trade. I'm optimistic that that will be possible. If Bitcoin doesn't make it as a cyber currency, and I'm cautiously optimistic that it will make it. But even if it doesn't make it, I think there will be something else. like it, that's smarter than it, that's more secure than it, that's more readily decentralized than it. So that's where I see the long term going as far as globalization is concerned. Short term, we are absolutely facing some challenges, and I think the reason the challenges are hard for us is because the benefits of trade barriers and protectionism are clear and specific and identifiable, immediate, but short term. If someone's job is saved as a result of a trade barrier or protectionism, that's immediately identifiable. It may be short-lived because that industry that individual is part of might disappear very quickly if it's not subject to market forces. I like to say that protectionism doesn't save industries, it freezes them so that they can't evolve. And imagine an organism from 100 million years ago trying to compete with an organism on Earth today. It wouldn't be very competitive because the organism today has had 100 million more years to evolve and improve its techniques for evolution. The same thing with industries that aren't subject to market forces. We see that in Detroit, for example, in the U.S. automotive industry, which was put out of business. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to be able to articulate as best we can the benefits of free trade. They are widely distributed. They're hidden. To use the words of Bastiat, they are unseen. And it is our job to make them as tangible and visible as possible. And in the course of today's discussion, maybe we'll do some of that, all of us, in the course of this panel.
Juan Ramón Rayo, de la tesis de Branko Milanovic sobre el elefante, ¿no? Que dice que las clases medias han sido los más perjudicados, las clases medias occidentales, los más perjudicados por la globalización. ¿Esto es así? ¿Hay perdedores de la globalización? ¿Forgotten, como dice Trump? Como ha dicho ahora Le Pen en Francia, los que han perdido la protección de la nación. ¿Hay estos perdedores, losers, en las clases medias occidentales?
There are some losers, absolutely. But they're not caused by globalization or free trade. Globalization and free trade, and I've been fortunate enough to be part of this process in the mining and exploration around the world, where the average mining company board now has directors from so many different countries. We all share technologies. That enables us to use the very best exploration techniques, drilling techniques, metallurgical techniques, marketing techniques for the metals. We're mining deposits that 20 years ago were sub-economic and would never be mined. We're surrounding ourselves with new townships, new schools, new generations of young people who they used to be educated to age 8 and now they're educated to age 16. I see so many advances. These are the middle-aged people who have been lifted by the productivity process that's been generated by globalization and free trade. The people that have missed out not because of globalization and free trade. They've missed out because politics is broken. Politics is broken in my country, Australia. From what I've learned recently about Spain, politics is broken in Spain. If you measure it by the things that governments do well, one is that they do very well at stealing our money. In Australia, an economist some years ago said that if the government steals more than 25% of our money, the country is doomed. In Australia, we're beyond that, we're 26.5%. is the government stealing. But worse here is 43% of your money is being stolen by your government. The people that are paying the huge burden in just seeing their money consumed by government, they're the people, they're the forgotten people. They're the people that my heart reaches out to. They're the people that must develop a voice, and they haven't got it in a situation where politics is broken as it is. We must repair politics. We must drive the politicians into a corner where they do only the limited few legitimate things that governments can do best, and we must seize back from them and do all those things that we should be doing for ourselves.
Thank you. ¿Qué le decimos, John, a los que son convocados como perdedores de la globalización en estas clases medias?
Well, there absolutely are some losers of free trade in the short term. But all of us are winners in the long term. A century ago, 40% of the U.S. workforce was engaged in agriculture. Today, it's about 2%. And yet the population of the U.S. is about 3 times as large today as it was a century ago. So 38%, 40 minus 2% of those people, it's not exactly that, but a huge number of people in agriculture have lost their jobs over the last century. Is that a bad thing? Well, no, because they've moved on to better jobs in manufacturing and IT, jobs that have more value add, jobs that let them earn more money and enjoy a higher quality of life. So there are losers in the short term, but all of us are winners in the long term in 2 ways. One, in greater choice of products and services from free trade, and 2, lower costs of products and services. Take the iPhone, for example. The iPhone would be impossible without globalization. The iPhone uses about 75 of the elements in the periodic table. That's about 2/3 of the elements in the periodic table. There is no country on earth that has all of the elements required to make an iPhone. You have to have free trade to have an iPhone. If we tried to make an iPhone all in one country, say the United States, well, first of all, it wouldn't be an iPhone because it would have to use other substitute materials, and 2, it would be considerably more expensive than it is today, so it would be less accessible. So we've enjoyed more choice and also lower costs. You know, we forget that if we can get goods and services lower cost by going overseas, that frees up capital here that we have to invest in new products and technologies. That helps our local economy. Larry Summers, the former U.S. Secretary of Treasury, was one of my classmates at MIT, and he says the price of virtually every product and service category that's subject to market forces has declined over the last 20 or 30 years. It's only the ones that he calls politically inflected, the ones that are insulated from exposure to market forces where prices have not gone down. Those are things like healthcare, housing, education. In these areas, we've seen a skyrocketing of costs because they're not subject to market forces. So these improvements in quality of life don't necessarily translate into increases in GDP or GDP per capita, but they improve quality of life nonetheless. I mean, who would rather have a television from 1980 as compared to one from today? Probably no one. Doesn't have as many challenges, as channels, as many features. Who would rather have a mobile phone from 1980 rather than one today? Well, probably none of us, because mobile phones didn't even exist in 1980. So you can see how our quality of life has improved thanks in large part to free trade and globalization, many of the improvements nowadays in particular do not increase GDP. They either don't affect it or they may decline it. So for example, when the camera got incorporated into the mobile phone, that decreased GDP because the sales of cameras now are much smaller than they were 20 years ago before they were incorporated into cell phones. All the sharing economy, all the virtualization of products and services and entertainment, education, increasingly healthcare, and so forth, are either not increasing or decreasing GDP. So GDP per capita is less and less a good measure of quality of life.
Lados. John, me pedías la palabra porque querías hacer alguna apostilla a Diego.
Well, when I think of unemployment, the first thing that comes to mind is entrepreneurship, because a disproportionately large percentage of new jobs come from small companies and startups. Well, I don't think we can blame globalization on a decline in entrepreneurship. If anything, globalization makes entrepreneurship easier. Goods and services are available at lower cost, raw materials, so it takes less capital for me as an entrepreneur to start a new company. There are many more new products and services available that I can either improve on or provide services to the suppliers of those products and services, or address niches between those products and services if I'm an entrepreneur. So the more globalization is, the more opportunity there is for me to find niches that I can either fill or consolidate. I started my first company in 1992. And so I've had a chance to see how the environment for starting a company has changed over the last 25 years. In most respects, it's easier, in my view, to start a company today than it was 25 years ago. You can find customers more easily. We didn't have the internet 25 years ago. Now you can go online to announce what you have. And to let people come to you. You can go online to find suppliers. You can see which potential products and services are available that you might be able to combine in novel ways to make your new product or service. You can see which investors have an interest that aligns with yours. You can outsource complete departments that don't align with your competitive advantage, so you don't have to waste time doing those things. Let someone else handle them. In all of those ways, entrepreneurship has become easier in the last 25 years. There's only one sense in which entrepreneurship has become harder in the last 25 years, in my experience, and that's regulatory compliance. Let me use just two examples. One, a worker status law. This is the law in the U.S. that determines whether a worker is an employee or a contractor. So if they're an employee, the employer is responsible for all kinds of benefits. If they're a contractor, it's simply a transaction with the individual employee, with the individual, just as if it would be if they were a third-party supplier. Well, there's a 6-page form in the U.S., the worker status form, IRS form SS8, that has to be filled out for every single employee to determine whether they're an employee or a contractor. If you want to make the case that they're a contractor, if you don't want to take the risk of mischoosing, you can hire another firm who will hire the individual as an employee, and then you hire that firm as a contractor. An expense and hassle for a young entrepreneur that's certainly a challenge and may be insurmountable. So, and I could give dozens of examples. They vary from industry to industry of all the different forms of regulation that have made starting businesses harder. One more example, licensing. Now, over 2/3, I understand, of the positions in the U.S. require people to have a license to practice whatever it is they do, whether it's a nurse or a massage therapist or whatever. Even braiding hair, a practice as safe and innocuous as braiding hair, which has been around for thousands of years, in over half of the US states, requires a license. Well, many of the people braiding hair are young black women. And to get a license in some states, a cosmetology license, might cost thousands of dollars. These young black women can ill afford $1,000 for a license to do what they are passionate about doing. So this is where I think we need to look to find the obstacles to employment.
Muy bien, gracias, John. Yo quería cambiar el sentido de la pregunta, es muy interesante lo que has dicho al final, para plantear una última cuestión a todos. ¿Es legítimo? ¿Cuál es la manera? ¿Es legítimo el proteccionismo defensivo? ¿Es legítimo? ¿Cómo debemos defendernos de un proteccionista? Si mañana ocurriera que Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, o Marine Le Pen, que lo ha anunciado también el lunes, impusieran su famosa tasa de ajuste en frontera del 35%, o aquel impuesto del 35% a las empresas que deslocalicen su actividad fuera de su país, si empezaran a surgir estas medidas en el escenario, ¿qué deben hacer? ¿Es legítimo el proteccionismo defensivo? ¿Cuál sería la mejor manera de reaccionar ante este tipo de políticas? Me gustaría que si puedes contestar tú primero.
Well, I'll just offer one thought, and then I'll seek the guidance of my fellow panelists here. If you thought that measure was going to happen sometime in the near future, the prudent thing to do, it seems to me, would be to go ahead and position the new factory or the plant or production facility outside of the country in question before the law takes effect, so that you're not penalized for the process of moving it overseas. And so that's clearly counterproductive from the standpoint of what the law was intended. And I think it just shows how it is so difficult to predict the unintended consequences of putting regulations like that in place.
¿Tienes una posición sobre esto?
While this discussion has been going on, I've thought of two wise observers. One was Ayn Rand, who wrote many interesting books, but she made the comment, they can only do to you what you let them do to you. And I always remember that as inspirational. And the other one was a friend of mine called Harry Brown, who wrote a wonderful book called How to Be Free in an Unfree World. And I recommend it as a book. It's a book that guided me because the Australian Taxation Department got too greedy with me at one stage. And I left. For 7 years, I didn't work in Australia. I worked elsewhere. And they were probably the 7 best years of my life. But after 7 years, the Taxation Department invited me back to come back on my terms. So I thought that was pretty reasonable. But don't let them do things to you. It's for you to stand up against them and be strong. I'll cover one point that hasn't been covered before, and it's this. I talked about politics being broken. I run a Mancal Economic Education Foundation. We've sent, over 20 years, we've sent more than 1,000 young Australians around the world to think tanks to understand the comparative advantages of one country versus another. So they have built into them the freedom to go wherever they choose to go. We concentrate on young people. I don't waste any time on people over the age of 40. And it was a little bit I learned from the Free Market Roadshow 2 years ago in Greece. I learned there's a similarity in Greece to Spain, to Australia, and that is anyone over 40 are comfortable. We've made our own arrangements. We know how to get around and get through all the loopholes. We're happy with that change, but it's the young people that are being left with the debt, that rolling avalanche, that tsunami of debt that's going to engulf our children and our grandchildren. It's the young people that we must focus our message on, because they're the people that will get angry about what's being done to them. The Chinese government is terrified of the young people, absolutely terrified. The Australian government is starting to realise there's a backlash from the young people when they realise what's being done to them. Cultivate the young people, develop in them the sense of anger that we should have ourselves.
Thank you.